Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Garden Design Principles for Supporting Student Learning. My name is Mara Gittleman. I'm the Workshops and Education Coordinator for NYC Parks GreenThumb. We are the part of the New York City Parks Department that works with community gardens across the city. And we're so excited to be here tonight with Adam Walker from the Battery Conservancy to share everything he knows about garden design for supporting student learning. Thank you everyone so much for coming tonight. We are recording this session. We'll have the recording focused on just the speaker, but you can decide whether your camera is on using the little camcorder icon at the bottom of your screen. Please use the chat for any questions. If you have any questions throughout Adam's talk, go ahead and put them there. I will hold on to them and ask them out loud during Q&A. We appreciate everyone tuning in tonight so much. Thank you for taking the time. And without further ado, Adam, the mic is yours.
Thanks, Mara. And thanks everyone for being here. And thank you to NYC GreenThumb for bringing us all together tonight. I love talking about gardens and garden design, so I'm very excited to be here and looking forward to discussing more about these topics with you all. My name is Adam Walker. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I manage programs for the Battery Conservancy in New York. I'll start with a really brief introduction to our work, and then I'll go into more of the agenda for today's discussion, and then we'll get right into it. So if you can't see the screen that I'm sharing, the slides here, please make a note in the chat, or if you're having any trouble hearing, please just make a note in the chat, and we will do what we can to address it. I'm coming to you from New York City, specifically the Battery, which is shown here at the southern tip of Manhattan. This is the unceded land of the Lenape tribe and is currently occupied by a 25-acre public park. It's a city park, but my organization, the Battery Conservancy, is the nonprofit partner to the city. So we're responsible for all stewardship and programming of the park space. When the Conservancy was founded in 1994, the park had fallen into some real disrepair, a lot of broken benches, broken asphalt paths, minimal garden plantings, minimal green space. And so much of our work since then has really focused on revitalizing the area and adding in more gardens and biodiversity to support our urban ecology. And so in 2011, actually at the request of some local high school students, the Conservancy created the Battery Urban Farm, which is an educational farm site, so a little different than most of the community gardens in New York City. And it consists of this half-acre vegetable garden, as well as another half-acre perennial forest farm that is focused more on native edible and medicinal plants. So here you see a volunteer harvesting persimmons from one of our native East Coast persimmon trees, some of the spring start to our asters poking up out of the ground, and some gooseberries, and visitors identifying different medicinal plants in the forest farm. So the farm spaces are the primary draw for many of our programs because they allow for so much hands-on engagement and interaction with the ecology of the space. In a normal year, we offer field trips for all students of all ages, as well as a stewardship lab program for middle and high school students that allows them recurring visits to the farm space throughout the seasons so that they can really see the benefits of their work and see the impact that they're having on the space. All of the produce that we grow is either used during programs to teach students about where food is coming from or to cook up salad snacks and things like that, or we donate the excess produce to hunger relief efforts. So specifically, Coalition for the Homeless is an organization that works in New York City, serving daily meals to anyone housed or unhoused that is in need of a nice meal. And they do that at locations throughout the city on a daily basis. So we're very glad to have them as one of our public partners and to know that everything that we're growing on this public land is in some way going back to the community. We also offer, beyond these student programs, family farm volunteer days on a regular basis, about once a month, so that students can return and bring their families and show them what they've been working on, or anyone in the community can come by and help out. And trainings and workshops for teachers, community gardeners, and other enthusiasts, and daily adult volunteer opportunities. So we really depend on all of our volunteers and program participants because we're such a limited staff at the Conservancy and could definitely not complete all of the work that we do on the farm without their help. Just to note that before joining the work of the Conservancy, I worked as a science teacher in San Francisco elementary schools, making heavy use of the 12-month growing season to teach outside in our school garden very often. And then I served as professional development manager for an AmeriCorps program that placed garden educators in schools to teach science and sustainability. So that's a lot of where I'm drawing some of my learning from in this regard. And that's a bit of background on me and our organization, and I'm excited for us to get into the meat of our discussion. So the goal of today's workshop is to provide you with concrete and ideas for simple changes to your garden site that will improve accessibility, simplify group management, and help students of all ages engage with the space in self-directed ways. So really, the hope is that these tips will be useful for supporting both children and adults that are visiting your garden space. And I'm sure we're all coming from different setups and situations, but I hope that there will be useful information and inspiration for everyone within this presentation. A little preview of what's ahead here. I'm going to ask you to take a moment to reflect on challenges that you have faced in your own space and to consider some of the student impulses that might arise in that space. Then I'll go in depth into examples of 4 guiding principles to support student success. We'll have some time to consider solutions to the challenges you've identified, and then we'll wrap up and hopefully have a good amount of time for questions. So we'll always be collecting questions in the chat. If anything comes up for you, feel free to write it in there, even if it's just a clarifying question. We'll try to address it quickly if we can, and otherwise we'll have ample time at the end to get into them. I did want to highlight one note before we really dive in, which is that we're talking about student success here, and that really that topic is much bigger than just the garden. We want to recognize that student success really depends on some deeper systemic structures. So things like food and housing security, keeping group sizes manageable and equitable, creating engaging, hands-on curriculum that meets students at their level, and building a culture of restorative justice within and beyond the garden. So we, of course, don't have time to get into all of these, but I hope we can all keep in mind throughout this discussion the need to support these efforts beyond just our garden work. Today, though, we will be focusing on the gardens. This presentation really looks at the physical elements of garden design, which can support whatever elements you have in place, no matter your group size or curriculum that you generally deal with. We'll also address some of the kind of cultural structures and uses of the space that can help to support student engagement. So off we go. I'd like to ask you to write down for yourself an aspect of managing groups in your garden space or an imagined garden space if you don't have one yet. And write down an aspect that you find challenging about managing groups in that space. Is it lining up? Is it finding enough space for everyone to work? Do you often have too many students and not enough for them to do? Is there a certain area of your garden that feels unused or like it could be more effective? So write down that challenge for yourself. We'll take a couple of minutes and we will be coming back to it later on. If you'd like to share in the chat what you're thinking of, would be very curious to see that, but it is certainly not required. Yeah, you can definitely post in the chat what your challenge is, but you do not have to. So if you've got those written down and those ideas in your head, I do have a question now for everyone, which is if you imagine your garden space or any garden space And imagine that without any instruction, you just let students loose to use it freely. I'm curious what you think they would do. If you just opened the gate and let them in, what would the students do? And I would ask that you put some answers into the chat of what comes to mind. Anybody have any thoughts on what students might do if set free in a garden? I see take photos with their phones. Run, students would run anywhere they wanted, maybe trample some plants. I think I'm going to add in here that some students would just maybe sit and talk with each other. I see eat the raspberries, eat the plants, maybe tear up some plants. Yeah, if we can get another couple ideas in there, that's great, but otherwise we will keep on moving. So with this question that we're thinking of, what would students do if given free reign of a garden? What we're asking here is not only what do students do in a garden, but how do they learn in that space? Because they're inherently curious and they are interested in learning and engaging and exploring with the space. Students want to explore hands-on. They want to feel useful. They learn by tearing things apart. They don't necessarily know all the ways they can engage with the space effectively. So we can structure the space and our outdoor teaching in ways that draw on these student impulses and desires and guide them to more productive and safe experiences. And so as we plan the space, we can really aim to engage all five senses, support physical and tactile exploration, allow for experimentation and self-guided initiative. We can try to build a structure that encourages new interests and questioning while supporting the group to complete set tasks. And we can create time for both meaningful teamwork as well as perhaps quieter personal reflection. And that's a tall order, but I really think that gardens are such vibrant spaces of possibility that can hold all of these different uses and all of these different potential approaches and possibilities. So these efforts then underpin all of our design elements, and we want to keep those in mind. It can raise exciting questions. For example, how do you set up a hose and watering system so it can best support teamwork and socialization? Or what tools and materials will engage students with new interests and encourage more questioning? Or what are students allowed to take apart, put together? Of course, the answers to these questions will all depend on this particular space you're working in and the communities you're working with, but we'll hope to come up with some answers for these and other questions tonight. So over the years, I've narrowed in myself on 4 principles that I think can help every educational garden move closer to its fullest potential. And they are to show more than tell, to echo supportive classroom structures, to engage imagination, and to dedicate time to training. So I'm going to show a range of examples to demonstrate what I mean for each of these points. And of course, as we said, the presentation is recorded, so you shouldn't feel the need to take extensive notes. But if you hear something that you think could help with the challenge that you wrote down at the beginning, then definitely try to make a note of that. Many of these following example photos that I'm sharing are coming from school gardens in San Francisco that I worked with, but the elements we're focusing on are certainly adaptable to a full range of garden spaces, whether large or small, urban or rural, anywhere that wants to engage students and visitors. So starting off, let's talk about showing more than telling. Our work will be so much easier if we use visual identifiers throughout the space. Things like colors, like patterns, like signage. You can see these beds here are painted in different colors, so it's easy to direct students to where you want them to be. So you could have 4 groups of an activity, and each group is assigned to a different bed or series of beds, all painted the same colors, and it offers really clear visual definitions for students about where they're working and where they need to go. Also makes it really easy if you are trying to gather everyone's attention to just say, we're going to circle up around the red bed right now. And it's a quick, simple support and scaffold that can really help with group management in a space like this. This garden here actually takes it one step further. They have seats colored to match different work tables so that when a class comes out to the garden and sits down, they're immediately broken up into groups and they'll know which table they're going to be working at and where they're going to be, just to help save some time in all the shuffling around that can sometimes happen when moving out into a garden space. So this seating area here uses visual stamps just from stencils on the bench to show students where they should sit, how much room to make for one another. And this school garden was located on the playground. And so they really had some difficulties as they were first getting set up with students running through the garden, kind of treating it more as a play area, you know, chasing down soccer balls or playing tag in the space. So they set up some garden boxes, growing boxes along the perimeter, and then they have this lattice fencing that you can see that just sets up a visual barrier to help remind students that when they're entering into the garden section of the playground, they're in a different space and they're going to treat it differently and behave differently in that space. So it's that visual signal that helps to show students that this is a different space and behavior needs to change in this area. They also painted some stamps on the ground to assist students with lining up before entering the garden. And so that lineup space was also a moment for students to catch their breath from the wildness of the playground and to reset their intention for entering the garden space and how they were going to behave there. If you have more of a wild space in your garden and you want students to be able to explore it without damaging the plants, I think paver stones are a really nice option, and they're often affordable and they can be quickly painted to brighten up the space. So suddenly students will have a very clear picture about where they can and cannot walk. And the younger ones especially will like enjoy the balance challenge of jumping from stone to stone. And these kind of twisting, winding paths really encourage students to slow down and not run through a space, but take their time and meander and maybe explore a little bit closer. You'll see some of these paths also kind of tuck behind different bushes, and they can encourage students to go explore in areas that they might not otherwise think of engaging with. So, you know, this school just had a short little strip of area where they were growing some of their perennial plants. They're California natives there, but they wanted students to feel welcomed to really engage up close with those plants. So they put a line of paver stones through that brief little planting strip, and it offered not just a description for students of where they could or couldn't walk, but really an invitation to explore that space more closely, because they're going to draw students in. They're colorful, they're intriguing, and students are going to want to take a walk on them. You can also consider using visual identifiers on staff and volunteers in your space. This is an example of a fourth grade student leader who's working at recess in one of the San Francisco gardens, helping younger students with a watering project. So it's not the best photo, but you can see each student leader was provided with a small cloth tool belt, and that made them feel more responsible and important. And it also signaled to the younger students that those older students were there to help them and were there to assist them. These are some examples of visual climate and weather stations that incorporate cardinal directions, cloud diagrams. You've got a windsock there, a thermometer, a space for students to write in with chalk their own observations about the weather. So even if you have just kind of a blank wall, there's a lot of possibilities that you can use to spruce it up and add more kind of visual engagement to draw students in to connecting with your garden space. So there are all kinds of possibilities for visual activation of the space, and these visual elements can really help to focus student attention. We also want to provide visual aids that can serve all visual students. On the left here is an example of PEC cards, also called picture exchange communication. And they are often used with students that are on the autism spectrum to help show them visually what activity they will be participating in first, what's going to come next, and then what will come later on in the day. And you know, it's easy enough for a garden to have a little stack of these cards laminated and cut out so that students that are visiting can see on the board even, or with an agenda that's written up or posted somewhere, what some of the major tasks they'll be participating in are for that day. It also helps any student that are English language learners or coming from a different background and still learning some of the terms and experiences for the garden. And so these kind of visual identifiers can really support them. On the right here, we have an example of these kind of laminated visuals of plants that we use in our garden whenever we are working with seeds in particular, or any of the plants that might not be readily apparent about what they are to students. So I have some of them here. We print them out as pictures and we laminate them. So we have one side that shows what the plant looks like when it's harvested. You can see on the screen there are red peppers, or green and orange and yellow peppers too. This card in my hand is beets. So on one side, the card shows what it looks like when harvested, and on the other side, it shows what it looks like in the ground when it's growing. So that if we're planting beet seeds with students, we can show them this card, ask them if they're familiar with beets, if they've ever tasted them, ask them if they know the word beet in any other languages, or if their family calls this plant something different. And then we can also show them what they would expect our seeds to grow into eventually. So it just helps to draw more on student understandings and their own experiences when we have these kind of visual cues and visual aids that can help to support them with understanding what we're working on. We also use some visual planting guides in our garden. So this here is actually green plastic fencing that we cut up into these long strips, and it has about 2-inch holes throughout the fencing. So we can lay this down on a garden bed and encourage students to make one hole for a seed in each of the openings in the fence line. And this just allows us to spend more time talking about what our plants need, why we're spacing them apart, and how that will support their growth, rather than so much time trying to navigate making a straight line or measuring out 2 inches between each hole that we're making, which, you know, if you're trying to support student math learning, that can be very useful. But for us, we're really focused on these conversations about the concepts of what plants need and the plant life cycle, and how we ourselves as farmers and scientists fit into that plant life cycle and how we depend on it. And so having a quick, easy visual guide like this for planting helps us to focus more of our attention on those conversations and less on some of the little details just about spacing and things like that. So that's a lot of different examples of some of the ways that visual aids and visual identifiers can help to support the learning in your garden space. Now, moving on to the next principle, which is to echo supportive classroom structures. Classrooms are not always set up for student success, but there are elements of most classrooms that I do think serve students and that we can adapt to suit our spaces. So for example, having clear seating and work areas like you see here, making sure that there's space for everyone, and sometimes having those stamps on the benches can help to ensure that there will be space for everyone when a class comes out. Also, here's another example of some seating areas. These stumps are actually movable, and then there are painted circles on the ground to show students where to return the stumps to. But this allows a teacher to shift out the size of the circle or the number of stumps depending on what kind of a group is coming through. And it also can mean that these stumps can serve some of them as seats and maybe some of them as little tables or writing areas if necessary. I'm also a big fan of providing student materials access. So you can see here in this image on the left, there are gloves hanging on the shed door that students can come and take and use and then put right back on their clips when they're finished. There are watering cans at a height that students can reach so that they could take them and then return them. You know, if you walk into a teacher's classroom, you'll often see really clear areas for where books go and shelves with clear buckets for pencils or pens or erasers or scissors or other materials that students might use regularly. And students are often trained by the teacher to take certain materials when they need them and then return them at the end of the day, or they have a job of cleaning up and putting materials back at the end of the day. So we can really set up similar systems in our gardens, and it can help to make the students feel more engaged and interested in participating in the space. And it also can help to ease some of the burden on the teacher or the facilitator when visitors and students are trained to engage with some of the materials just on their own and on their own time. So this photo here, you can see at the bottom there in the milk crate are some easily accessible clipboards for students to grab, as well as trays for them to turn in work once they complete it. And if you don't have space for all of this, a full table, a whiteboard, clipboards and things like that, you might think about just getting some kind of a mobile cart that has some containers on it, could have some magnifying lenses in it or some gloves in one container, maybe some field guides in another, things that students might engage with regularly. And then you can bring that out to the garden whenever there's some kind of activity or open free time or otherwise happening there. And students can know when they see the cart that there are some options available to them to engage with those materials and to explore the garden using those. So it can be both a student materials access and a visual identifier for them. Students also really benefit from consistency. So as much as possible, we want consistency in the rules and routines that we use in our spaces. And if you have a school garden, if you can take the widespread school rules and adapt them to your space, then students, I think, will respond really well to those. So these outdoor classroom agreements use the language of their schools and those guidelines that the school has, but then they express specifically what that means in the garden. So this one school went by the 3 Bs: be safe, be kind, be responsible. And on this kind of guideline board, they showed what being safe means in the garden. It means to use tools safely, it means to walk on the paths, and it means to keep bodies calm. I think that these agreements, even if you are not in a school garden or adapting from school rules and routines that are really present and known by the students, if you're in a community garden, you can also have a clearly visible and visual list of some of the expectations for engaging with the garden space. And if you make it more visual and include pictures and images, that can also help to draw people's eyes in so that they actually read the suggestions that you have and the guidelines that you're asking everyone to agree to. You can also check in with teachers about the routines and the attention getters that their students are used to. So maybe that means a bell or a noisemaker to gather their attention. Maybe it means particular checks for understanding. Some teachers really use like a Me Too symbol, or some teachers use wiggly hands to signify agreement. Some teachers also might have, particular task sheets that they write up for students, and the students might be used to seeing a particular style of agenda on the board that helps them to recognize what they're being asked to do. So checking in with your teachers or other people that use your garden space can always be useful to help build in more of that consistency across visits or across spaces that students are working with. Also, many classrooms incorporate some type of element of free time or choice time with different stations. And that routine can be helpful when students don't all finish their work at the same time. And so we're going to actually talk more about that later on. We will be coming back to that. The next principle, though, is to engage imagination. We want to make space for curiosity. Here we have an area for collecting treasures that were found in the garden. So many times, I think those of us working in gardens find that students are so interested and engaged with the materials that they want to hold on to them and take them home with them. And if that is a challenge for you, something like this allows students a place where they can put the items that they found to show the rest of the community how special they are and to share them rather than needing the urge to take them home. I also really encourage having some of these open-ended spaces in gardens, like we saw earlier in earlier slides, areas where students can kind of build small structures out of sticks or flip over stones or logs or paver stones to look for different bugs and creatures, or just imagine themselves as animals in the wild roaming around the space. This is not the best photo once again, but you could imagine how you might paint some of these paver stones to make it clear that they could be lifted to look underneath for bugs, and how other paver stones might be painted just with, say, footprints to show that those paver stones are just for stepping on. So there's a lot you can do in a space just with those visual identifiers, also to make some room for curiosity and exploration. We also want to follow students' lead, meaning that we want to take some time to give students free rein of our garden spaces and see what they're drawn to. So are they wanting to dig? Are they wanting to climb? How can we support those impulses in productive ways? If you observe students in your space moving freely, you might see which areas are of most interest to them or which areas they really don't engage with very closely, and that could give you a signal of where you might want to dedicate some more of those visual identifiers or resources or tools to help direct student attention in the ways that you'd like to see it utilized. So these observations that you make can really influence your design decisions for your space. And finally, we want to incorporate non-gardening tasks in our garden whenever possible. Often with gardens and gardeners, there isn't enough work for every student that's moving through the space to keep everyone engaged, or students might get tired of just weeding day after day if they're coming and it's the height of summer and that's really the primary work task that is most needed in the space. So their experience in the space will be more robust if they engage with it from a variety of angles and approaches. I'm going to post a link in the chat here, which is our handout on non-gardening tasks that we think are a good fit for most garden spaces, just something to sort of spark your inspiration for your own space. Things like writing how-to books, poetry about the space, maybe modeling weather, erosion, and deposition by building a model mountain out of soil. You could make garden decorations that deter birds, whether it be objects that reflect light or little rocks painted to look like strawberries, or using math and observations to estimate the number of pollinators that visit your garden every day. There's a lot of potential in these spaces that go beyond just planting. So I'm going to paste this link in the chat, and if you want to click on that, that'll have some of our non-gardening task ideas to help get you your own inspiration sparked. And now the final principle. We want to dedicate time to training. Our students really want to be useful in our garden spaces, and we might think it's clear how to hold and use a trowel safely, but it really isn't for all students. They haven't all engaged with the tools that we're working with. And so this is perhaps the most important principle in my eyes. I think we're always eager to get students planting immediately or tasting things as soon as possible, but we will really serve our students well if we carefully provide them with the skills to be successful in a space. And that takes a fair amount of time. So this goes for students of any age, really, even adults. And this training can also set us up to be much more comfortable giving students free time in our garden spaces, because we'll know that they are aware of what they can engage with and how best to engage with it across all different areas of our garden. So I'm a big proponent of self-directed stations. And we saw some of the student materials access earlier in one of the principles, but these self-directed stations kind of take it one step further and set up whole areas where students can learn the routine for using a particular tool or object and then returning it. So here we see a watering station, just some watering cans hung on the garden beds, and then there is a simple plastic tub that is filled up with water that the students can dunk their watering cans and then go water around in the garden. And so a station like this still allows a facilitator to say, close that tub if watering isn't happening that day, or to leave it empty and not full of water if watering isn't happening. But students can know, if it's free time in the garden, that they can walk up to this watering station, and if they see water in the tub, they know that they're cleared to grab a watering can, do some watering, and then they know where to return it onto the hooks at the end of their time using that tool. These images are of more different types of watering stations. So even something as simple as a bin and a stack of watering cans can turn into a self-directed station if students are provided with a little bit of training on what that bin means, where it goes, and how to use it effectively. Another big popular one across many gardens is a soil exploration station, or also called a dig zone. Some of the, this is where students get to dig. They get to look for worms. They get to maybe build some of those small structures out of leaves or twigs. They get to pretend that they're cooking up something in the garden. It's really a free space for them to engage with. And some of these dig zones can even be big enough to fit a whole class, and can really offer opportunities to talk about geology, weathering, erosion, landscapes, and those larger concepts of earth science that sometimes are harder to find the space for in a garden setting. Also, students are big fans of cleaning up and feeling responsible and picking up litter if they're given the tools and the training to do it. So I'm a big fan of having brooms and dustpans in gardens, especially if you are working in a school garden and you're maybe on asphalt or working around raised bed spaces. If you are in a more natural garden that has mulch paths or otherwise, you can get those like trash grabber picker-uppers that students will have a lot of fun moving around and grabbing different pieces of trash and putting it in the trash bin. And then once again, they can be trained on this system so that they know when they see some trash, how to go grab the trash picker, pick it up, throw it away, and help to clean up the garden. We have more station ideas here. The watering station is one, the soil exploration station, but you could also have a worm bin where students can be trained on how to explore the worms or how to help feed them food scraps. Some scavenger hunt sticks written on popsicle sticks where they pull out from a cup a particular thing that says, go find a plant with a red leaf. They have to go find it, and then they bring the stick back to trade it in for another one. You could have binoculars for bird watching, magnifying glasses, natural art materials, or a natural art making area where students know they can go and use little rocks or sticks or otherwise to build different structures. You could have a tool cleaning station, especially for older students, could be really effective. Field guides that they can use to explore the plants and the pollinators that are throughout the garden. Compost sifting station, weeding area where there are trugs and buckets and gloves that they know they can grab to do some weeding. And maybe there are little flags in different beds or a sign that says which bed is good for weeding on a particular day. There's a lot of options for how you would set up these self-directed stations. And then also a quiet area, like some call them peace corners, where there's a nice, maybe shady spot for sitting and reflecting if a student feels like they just want some time to enjoy the garden space on their own. So with each of these stations, I really encourage practicing student use of the different tools and cleanup. And all of these station ideas are also listed on that document that I linked to in the chat, along with the non-gardening tasks. So feel free to take a look at that and save that document if these are of interest to you. As I was saying, with each of these stations, I really encourage taking that time to train students on how to engage with them. So in this image, we see that this was a group of first graders that was practicing using trowels and working together in the dig zone. And during our training session, we had time to talk through what it meant to work together and share tools in the dig zone. We also talked about safe use of the trowel in the space, and we all practiced collecting a trowel, using it, and then putting it away. So at the next class then, if some students finish their work early, they could go and they know the process for engaging with the dig zone. And if they have free time, the teacher will feel really good about just letting them go and use that space, knowing that they've been trained on how to use it. But we don't just want to train the students. In fact, we also want to train the teachers. So, whether or not teachers will be leading classes in our garden, it will definitely be helpful for them to know the guidelines and the possibilities for the space, because many teachers that work in schools with schools gardens but don't directly engage with them, it might be because they just don't understand what are some possibilities for how they might engage with that space. And if they could have a once a semester little meeting with whoever the facilitator is for that garden space and get a better sense of all that's happening there and all the possibilities for their students, it might really make them feel better and more comfortable about bringing their students out into that garden space themselves. So with all of that, I know we moved through pretty quickly, but that wraps up the 4 principles for supporting student success through garden design. And I've summarized them here. So I was hoping at this point that we could look back at our challenges that we wrote at the beginning of this session. And for those who maybe joined a little bit later, I asked folks at the start to think about one of the challenges they face in their garden space, whether it be not enough work for students to do, or classes that are too big to manage, or trouble with lining up, or things like that. And I was hoping we could revisit those challenges that you wrote down and take a moment to think if some of these principles or these approaches might potentially offer solutions. So I'm going to put this prompt here. How could these design principles help you work through that challenge? I'm going to put that in the chat, and I'm going to return to the last slide and give us a moment to consider what might have stood out to you out of these principles. And if you're willing to share your ideas or any comments you have in the chat, we would love to hear it. We'll take just 4 or 5 minutes for this piece. we'll take just another 2 minutes here to give folks a chance to add any ideas to the chat. It sounds like some of those non-gardening tasks could be especially useful for big groups or high school groups that want to be more engaged, but there might not be enough garden work for everyone to just be planting. Someone mentioned that the specifics of clarifying different ages, different areas could be useful, and some of these self-directed kind of stations could be useful for their space in terms of keeping students engaged and focused. So this is moving us toward the closing of my portion of tonight. I hope that seeing some of these examples has given you some inspiration, and that this list of these garden design principles can help you to think through what some of the possibilities are for how you'd like to organize your space and how you can better support student engagement and interaction with the spaces. So if you have any questions that have come up during this presentation, please add them to the chat. We have ample time to answer them, and I just really appreciate your participation. This is my email and our website if you'd like to stay in touch at all. We have some more resources on our website you can explore, like our approach to field guides, pollinator identification, medicinal plant identification, tree identification. We have some scavenger hunts that we have drawn up for our park site and garden site. So those can offer you further inspiration if you do some exploring on our website.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was a really fun presentation. I learned so much about designing spaces for younger people. And it made me want to be more organized in my personal life. I was like, color coding, huh? That could help. And we also consider non-gardening tasks in community gardens for adults and for the public as a way to engage folks, especially if they're on a wait list for a raised bed, or if the garden doesn't have any raised beds. There's so many admin tasks that I bet middle school and high school students would be really into, like event planning and carrying out a tour for other students. I don't know if they have access to like garden social media and whatever, but taking photos that someone else could share on social media or the website, writing newsletters for funders, things like that. I think there's a lot out there that overlaps with our community garden work.
Yeah, so many good ideas. The list goes on.
If folks have questions, please add them to the chat. Seeing a lot of gratitude for you in the chat. Someone said, thank you, great job. But this has been a fantastic resource. I appreciate the opportunity to learn. Great. So thank you so much, Adam. We really appreciate you sharing all of your design knowledge and expertise with us tonight. Thank you.